Shaq was enjoying a quiet afternoon when a sharp, entitled voice shattered the peace. "Get out of my pool! People like you don't belong here!" The entire poolside froze. Conversations died. All eyes turned to the scene unfolding. A smug woman stood with her arms crossed, glaring at a young black boy in the water. But before the boy could even respond, Shaq slowly stood up, towering over everyone. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he smirked, because he already knew how this would end. By the time it was over, she was banned, the pool was drained, and Shaq had rewritten the rules forever. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Shaquille O'Neal leaned back in his private cabana, the sun warm against his skin, a cold drink in his hand. The scent of sunscreen and chlorine filled the air as children splashed and laughed in the shimmering blue water of the upscale resort pool. He was here to relax, unwind. But then, he heard it. A sharp, entitled voice cut through the summer air like a blade. "Hey, get out of this pool!" Shaq's brow furrowed as he turned his head. A middle-aged woman in an expensive sun hat and oversized sunglasses stomped toward the pool's edge, her face twisted in disgust. A small black boy, maybe 10 years old, stood frozen, waist-deep in the water, eyes wide with confusion. "But I have a membership," the boy stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman scoffed. "I highly doubt that." Shaq sat up, setting his drink down. Other swimmers started to notice, their conversations dying as they turned to watch. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others just shook their heads and looked away. The lifeguard hesitated on his perch, clearly unsure of what to do. Karen, the name fit her energy perfectly, crossed her arms. "I've never seen you here before, and I know everyone in this community." The boy, Jaden, took a small step back, gripping the edge of the pool. "My dad got me a membership for my birthday." Karen let out a sharp laugh. "Sure he did." She turned to the lifeguard, jabbing a manicured finger toward Jaden. "Make him leave." Now Shaq exhaled slowly, placing his sunglasses on the table beside him. He cracked his neck, then rose to his full height, towering over the cabana. Every head turned as he stepped forward, his sheer presence shifting the energy in the air. Karen, still oblivious, continued her tirade. "We have rules here, and I don't need some kid ruining them." A deep, rumbling voice cut her off. "Why don't you leave instead?" The pool deck went silent. Karen's head snapped toward him, her mouth still half open. The lifeguard stiffened. Jaden, still gripping the edge of the pool, let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Shaq folded his arms, his expression unreadable. Karen blinked rapidly, as if just realizing who she was dealing with. Her lips curled into a smirk. "And who do you think you are?" Karen's expression twisted into one of defiance as she squared her shoulders, her gaze locked onto Shaq with a mixture of irritation and disbelief. The pool deck had gone quiet, save for the faint splashing of water in the background, but she didn't seem to notice, or care, that every eye was now on her. She tilted her head slightly, scrutinizing the towering man before her, before letting out an exaggerated sigh. "And who exactly do you think you are?" she demanded, her arms folding tightly across her chest as if she were preparing for battle. Shaq remained unfazed, his imposing figure relaxed but unwavering. A small smirk played on his lips, his tone calm yet firm. "I don't know, lady," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Who do you think I am?" Karen scoffed at his response, her fingers tightening over the strap of her designer handbag. "Just another troublemaker," she muttered, shaking her head. A soft cough interrupted the tension, coming from the lifeguard stand a few feet away. The young lifeguard, barely out of his teens, leaned down slightly and spoke in a hushed voice. His words meant only for Karen. That's Shaquille O'Neal." For the first time, Karen hesitated. She blinked, her lips parting slightly as if the name was bouncing around in her mind, searching for significance. Her gaze flickered back to Shaq, scanning his familiar face, taking in his massive frame, and then darting back to the lifeguard, as if seeking confirmation. Then, just as quickly, she scoffed again and straightened her posture. "So what?" she said, waving a dismissive hand through the air. I don't care if he's the president. Rules are rules. Shaq exhaled through his nose, a slow and deliberate sound, before shifting his stance. He glanced around at the stunned crowd, taking in the shocked faces, the whispered murmurs traveling through the pool deck like a wave. When he spoke, his voice was even, but there was an undeniable weight to it. Right, he said, nodding slightly. Rules are rules, but only for certain people, huh? Karen's jaw clenched, the accusation striking a nerve. Excuse me, she shot back, eyes narrowing. Shaq remained calm, his gaze unwavering. He lifted his chin slightly and gestured toward the pool, where children were still splashing and laughing, blissfully unaware of the growing tension on the deck. You didn't seem to have a problem with them jumping in, he pointed out, his voice low and deliberate. So why is this different? Karen's face turned a shade darker, her fingers twitching slightly against the strap of her handbag. But instead of answering, she let out an exasperated breath and rolled her eyes dramatically. This conversation is over, she snapped, adjusting her posture as if dismissing the entire confrontation. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and strode purposefully toward the pool. Her sandals smacked against the wet pavement as she marched forward, her eyes locked onto Jaden. Determination set in her features as she reached out a hand, her voice sharp and unyielding. I'll handle this myself. Karen's heels clicked sharply against the wet pavement as she stormed forward, her narrowed eyes locked onto Jaden. The boy, barely 10 years old, stood frozen at the edge of the pool, his fingers gripping the metal railing as confusion flickered across his face. He had been laughing just moments ago, splashing in the water like any other kid. But now his joy had been replaced by uncertainty, his small frame stiffening under the weight of Karen's glare. You need to leave, she snapped, extending a manicured hand toward him. Before she could make contact, a massive shadow loomed over her. Shaq stepped in front of Jaden, his towering frame completely blocking her path. The sheer size difference between them was almost comical. Karen, a middle-aged woman barely reaching his chest, now found herself staring at a wall of muscle and authority. She stumbled back instinctively, her breath hitching as she craned her neck to meet his eyes. Shaq didn't raise his voice. Didn't have to. Instead, he lowered it, his deep baritone carrying more weight than any shout ever could. Lady, he said, his tone slow and deliberate, I highly suggest you step away. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every set of eyes around the pool was locked onto them, watching, waiting. Even the lifeguard, who had been hesitant before, took a cautious step forward, looking between Shaq and Karen like he was witnessing an unstoppable force meet an immovable object. Karen's face twisted, the initial shock giving way to indignation. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, her entire body trembling, not with fear but with sheer frustration. I don't care who you think you are, she spat. This is private property, and I have every right to decide who. Shaq didn't budge. His expression remained unreadable, his posture unshaken. Karen huffed, her face turning red. Fine, she seethed, her voice dripping with venom. I'm calling the manager. She spun on her heel, marching toward the lifeguard stand with a purpose, already digging her phone out of her overpriced handbag. Karen's heels clicked against the concrete as she stomped toward the lifeguard stand, her phone pressed firmly against her ear. Get the manager down here now, she barked, her voice sharp enough to slice through the murmurs of the watching crowd. Jaden shrank back slightly, his small fingers gripping the metal pool railing as he cast a nervous glance at Shaq. But Shaq remained still, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable beneath his dark sunglasses. He didn't have to say anything. His presence alone was enough to make the air around them feel heavier. Within moments, a man in a navy blue polo and khakis strutted toward the scene, his chest puffed out like he had just been called to handle a national emergency. His name tag read James Parker, pool manager, and the smug smirk on his face made it clear he already knew who had summoned him. Karen's lips curled into a triumphant grin as she gestured wildly toward Jaden. Finally, this little troublemaker doesn't belong here. Do your job and throw him out. James glanced between Karen and the boy, then turned his attention to Shaq. His smugness faltered for half a second before he cleared his throat and straightened his posture. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remove the child. The pool is at capacity. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Capacity, huh? His voice was dangerously calm, a stark contrast to Karen's shrill tone. James nodded, crossing his arms. That's right. Rules are rules. Shaq slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing the icy stare beneath. Funny, he said, tilting his head slightly. It wasn't at capacity 5 minutes ago when other kids were jumping in. Karen beamed, taking James' silence as agreement. See? Even the manager agrees with me. Now, get him out. Jaden shifted uncomfortably, looking up at Shaq as if searching for reassurance. The crowd around them had grown, with more people watching from the lounge chairs and poolside tables, their murmurs growing louder. Some guests exchanged concerned glances, while others whispered in disbelief at what they were witnessing. Shaq let out a deep breath, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off invisible tension. All right, he said, his voice steady. You want to play games? He slid his phone out of his pocket, a slow smirk spreading across his face. Let's play. Karen's smug grin didn't waver as she watched Shaq pull out his phone, but a flicker of annoyance crossed her face. She folded her arms tightly and let out a dramatic sigh, tilting her head as if already bored with the conversation. Oh, what now? She drawled, tapping her foot against the pool deck. Calling your lawyer? Gonna try to make a big fuss over nothing? You can whine all you want, but the rules are the rules. Beside her, James Parker, the resort's pool manager, stood tall with an air of authority, though a slight tension tightened his jaw. He crossed his arms as well, mirroring Karen's confidence. That's right, he said, his voice firm. We have policies in place, and if we start making exceptions, then what's the point of having rules at all? Shaq, unbothered by their posturing, pressed a button on his phone and lifted it to his ear, his deep voice cutting through the afternoon air like a slow, rolling wave. Hey, he said casually, his tone so calm that it almost sounded indifferent. Yeah, I need a favor. Karen snorted, shifting her weight to one side. A favor? She repeated mockingly, exchanging a smirk with James. Oh, please. You can call whoever you want, but it won't change a thing. That kid has no business being here, and quite frankly, neither do you. James nodded in agreement, but his fingers twitched slightly at his sides. Though he tried to maintain his confident stance, there was something about Shaq's relaxed demeanor that unsettled him. Shaq turned his head slightly, his sharp gaze locking onto James for the first time. The slow smirk that spread across his face wasn't just amusement, it was a warning. Nah, he said, tucking his phone away. I'm not calling a lawyer. Karen's smirk faltered just slightly, her eyebrows knitting together in confusion. Then who? She demanded, the first hint of uncertainty creeping into her voice. Shaq leaned back against a nearby pool chair, folding his massive arms across his chest. His voice was calm, deliberate, and laced with something that sent an almost imperceptible shiver through James's spine. The actual owner of this place. Silence fell over the pool deck like a thick, heavy blanket. Karen blinked, her mouth opening slightly as if she hadn't quite processed what she just heard. James, on the other hand, reacted differently. His confident posture stiffened, his expression shifting as his mind scrambled to make sense of Shaq's words. James cleared his throat, though his voice came out weaker than before. What do you mean? He asked, his earlier arrogance now laced with hesitation. Shaq exhaled slowly, his smirk never fading, as he pulled his sunglasses from his face and tucked them into the collar of his shirt. You heard me, he said, his tone as smooth as ever. He'll be here in 5. James felt a prickle of sweat at the back of his neck as Karen's confidence visibly cracked. Both of them turned toward the entrance, the tension rising with every second. The low hum of an approaching engine cut through the thick tension that hung over the pool deck. A sleek black car glided into the parking lot, its polished surface gleaming under the summer sun. Every pair of eyes turned toward it, sensing that something big was about to happen. Karen shifted nervously, her once smug expression now tinged with confusion. James, who had been standing tall just moments ago, swallowed hard, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. The driver's door opened smoothly, and out stepped a man in a tailored navy blue suit, his polished dress shoes clicking softly against the pavement. He exuded the kind of effortless power that didn't need to be announced. It was simply felt. Shaq's face lit up with an easy smile as he stepped forward and extended his hand. "Long time no see, Hendricks." Mr. Hendricks, the CEO of the resort, returned the handshake with a firm grip, his expression warm but laced with curiosity. "Shaquille," he greeted, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "Didn't expect to see you here today." Karen's head snapped between the two men, her lips parting as a realization started dawning on her. "Wait, you know him," she blurted, her voice an octave higher than before. James, meanwhile, had gone rigid. His throat bobbed as he forced himself to stay composed, but the slight tremor in his fingers betrayed him. "Uh, sir," he said carefully, stepping forward with forced confidence. "We were just handling a situation here at the pool." Hendrick's gaze slid over to James, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "A situation?" he repeated, his tone unreadable. James cleared his throat, suddenly aware that every word he spoke carried weight. "Yes," he continued. "There was a concern about guest policies, and we were in the process of resolving it." Shaq folded his arms, watching with amusement as James struggled to maintain his composure. Karen, however, wasn't as careful. She scoffed loudly. "Yes, this man," she pointed dramatically at Shaq, "thinks he can just make demands because he's famous. And that kid doesn't belong here." Hendricks slowly turned his head toward her, his expression turning to one of disbelief. "Excuse me." Karen's confidence faltered. I mean, this pool has rules and we were just enforcing them." The silence that followed was heavy. Then Hendricks exhaled sharply and turned back to James. "Mind explaining what's really going on here?" James's face paled as he realized he had no good answer. He forced a tight smile and let out a shaky laugh. Uh, it's just a misunderstanding." Karen stood her ground, her arms tightly crossed over her chest, her lips curled in defiance. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and yet she seemed completely oblivious to the shift in power happening right before her eyes. "I still don't want him in my pool," she spat, her voice sharp with entitlement. Hendricks slowly turned his head to look at her, his eyebrows raising as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. His expression remained calm, but there was something in his eyes, an unspoken warning. "Your pool," he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. Shaq, who had been watching the scene unfold with a knowing smirk, finally let out a low chuckle. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, then took a slow step forward, towering over Karen with effortless dominance. "That's funny," he said, his deep voice carrying across the deck. He paused just long enough to let the weight of his words sink in before tilting his head slightly. "Because," Karen huffed impatiently. "Because what?" she snapped. Shaq's smirk widened, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded document. With casual confidence, he handed it to Hendricks, who unfolded it and quickly scanned the contents. His eyes widened slightly before he nodded, then turned the paper around so Karen and James could see. The bold letters at the top read, "Property Ownership Transfer Agreement." Karen's face drained of color as her eyes darted between the document and Shaq's unreadable expression. James took a nervous step back, his face twisting in shock. Shaq clapped a hand on Hendrick's shoulder. "I just bought the entire resort." The words landed like a bombshell. The murmurs among the guests turned into full-blown gasps, and even the lifeguards exchanged stunned glances. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no words came out. James, who had been smugly standing by her side minutes ago, looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Shaq exhaled, stretching his arms out slightly as if shaking off the weight of the moment. "So," he said, looking down at Karen, "you were saying something about who belongs here?" Karen's breath hitched, her confidence crumbling as she realized for the first time she had just lost the biggest battle of her life. The silence that followed Shaq's announcement was deafening. Karen stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The smug arrogance that had been plastered on her face only moments ago had completely evaporated, replaced with sheer disbelief. "What?" she finally managed to choke out, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and shock. "You can't do that." Shaq casually rolled his shoulders, as if the situation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Actually, Karen," he said smoothly, "I can." Because I own this place now. James, the so-called manager, looked like he was on the verge of passing out. His face had gone so pale it was almost translucent. "Sir, let's not be too hasty," he stammered, clearly scrambling to salvage his position. "Maybe we can find another solution." Shaq lifted a single hand, silencing him instantly. His eyes never left Karen's as he turned slightly toward Hendricks. "Empty the pool," he said, his voice calm but commanding. Hendricks didn't hesitate. He gave a sharp nod. "Drain it." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of resort guests. The lifeguards exchanged uncertain glances, waiting to see if this was some sort of joke. But when Hendricks gestured firmly toward the control panel near the cabana, they sprang into action. A loud mechanical click echoed through the air. Within seconds, the drains at the bottom of the pool roared to life. A powerful suction pulled at the water's surface, creating swirling currents as the pool slowly began to empty. The once lively turquoise water started sinking, revealing the smooth tile floor beneath. Karen's breath hitched. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she spun toward Shaq, her face twisted in fury. "This is insane!" she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch. "You're ruining everything! You're ruining this place!" Shaq remained unfazed. He leaned back slightly, his massive frame still towering over her. "Am I?" he mused, watching the water spiral downward. "Or am I just making sure things finally get done right?" The guests at the resort were whispering amongst themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the moment. The same pool that Karen had once claimed as her own, the one she had so confidently tried to gatekeep, was now being drained before her very eyes. "You can't just—" Karen turned wildly to Hendricks, looking for backup. "Tell them to stop. This is a five-star resort. What will people think?" Hendricks barely spared her a glance. "They'll think it's about time for some changes around here." Karen let out a strangled sound of frustration. "You can't just take something away from everyone because of one incident." Shaq raised an eyebrow, folding his arms. "Oh?" His voice was full of mock curiosity. "So you don't like the idea of being punished for someone else's actions?" Karen paled. Shaq's smirk widened. "That's funny," he said, watching the last of the water spiral down the drains. "Because that's exactly what you tried to do to Jaden." Karen stumbled backward, speechless, as realization dawned on her. But Shaq wasn't finished yet. He had one more move left to play. The last traces of water gurgled down the pool drains, leaving behind nothing but slick, glistening tiles. A heavy silence settled over the resort as guests stood in disbelief, their excitement replaced with murmurs of confusion and frustration. Some clutched their towels, others held onto their sunglasses, but all eyes remained on one person, Karen. Karen's face was twisted in rage, her chest heaving as she pointed a trembling finger at Shaq. "This is discrimination," she screeched, her voice raw with fury. "You can't just shut down the entire pool because of one person. This isn't fair." Shaq let out a deep chuckle, the sound rolling through the air like distant thunder. He stepped forward, his towering presence casting a long shadow over Karen. His expression was calm, almost amused. "Oh?" he said, tilting his head slightly. "So you don't like the idea of being excluded?" Karen faltered. Shaq let the words settle in before he continued. "You're mad because now you don't get to swim. You're mad because something was taken away from you for no reason." He shook his head, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Now imagine how that little boy felt when you tried to kick him out." A few guests in the crowd nodded in quiet agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly aware of how the situation had escalated. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, but the fire in her eyes hadn't died. "That's different," she spat. "This is a luxury resort. People paid good money to be here." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "And you think Jaden's family didn't?" His gaze swept across the watching crowd, his voice growing louder. "How many of y'all have ever been turned away from something just because of how you look? How many of y'all have ever been treated like you don't belong?" A murmur spread through the guests. A few people nodded. Others exchanged glances, uncomfortable but unable to argue. Karen scoffed, folding her arms. "This is ridiculous. You're ruining this place." Shaq smirked. "Nah, I'm fixing it." He turned toward Hendricks, the resort's CEO, who had been silently observing the entire exchange. "Drains done?" Shaq asked. Hendricks glanced at the empty pool and nodded. Done. Shaq clapped his hands together once. Good. His gaze flicked back to Karen, his smirk widening. Now we rebuild. With real rules. Karen took a step back, her confidence wavering. The game had changed, and for the first time, she wasn't the one making the rules. A week had passed since the dramatic shutdown of the resort's exclusive pool, and the transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Where there was once a shimmering body of water surrounded by silent tension and exclusivity, now stood something far greater, a symbol of unity, opportunity, and change. The sun hung high over the resort as guests began to gather around the newly renovated pool. A massive blue ribbon stretched across the entrance, fluttering in the warm breeze. Reporters lined up with cameras eager to capture the event. Families of all backgrounds, some guests, some from surrounding communities, chatted excitedly, their children clutching towels and inflatable swim rings, ready to jump in. At the center of it all stood Shaq, dressed in a crisp white polo and sunglasses, towering over the crowd with a broad smile. A microphone was placed in his hand, and as soon as he stepped forward, the crowd quieted in anticipation. I told y'all we were gonna rebuild this place, Shaq began, his deep voice carrying across the resort. And I meant it. He gestured to the pool behind him. This ain't just a pool anymore. This is a place where every kid, every family, no matter where they come from, can swim, learn, and have fun without anyone making them feel like they don't belong. A round of applause rippled through the crowd. Some of the resort's longtime guests looked skeptical, but many others nodded in approval, realizing the impact of the change. Shaq continued. Starting today, we're offering free swimming lessons for underprivileged kids, because no child should grow up afraid of the water just because they didn't have access to a pool. He grinned. And the best part? This place isn't owned by some snobby CEO anymore. He turned to Mr. Hendricks, who stood beside him with an approving nod. This resort now belongs to me, Shaq announced, and I say everyone is welcome. The crowd erupted into cheers. Parents clapped, kids jumped up and down, and even some resort staff smiled, clearly relieved by the shift in leadership. But amidst all the celebration, one person was conspicuously missing, Karen. A guest whispered, "What about that woman? The one who started all this?" Shaq smirked, raising the microphone once more. "Oh, Karen?" He let the name hang in the air before shaking his head. "Yeah, she's banned for life." The crowd burst into laughter as the camera panned to the entrance, where Karen stood, red-faced and fuming, realizing she'd just lost everything. Karen had always prided herself on being well-respected in her social circles, but that illusion shattered overnight. The video of her berating a child at the resort pool spread like wildfire across social media. Within hours, it was on every major platform: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. The hashtags #poolside Karen and #let him swim trended for days. People dissected every frame of her entitled meltdown, and memes flooded the internet. The backlash wasn't just online. Her employer, an upscale real estate firm, caught wind of the scandal when a local news station ran the footage on television. The very next morning, Karen arrived at work, expecting sympathy from her colleagues. Instead, she was met with awkward glances and hushed whispers. Her boss, Mr. Caldwell, called her into his office. He leaned back in his leather chair, remote in hand, and pressed play on the massive flat screen mounted on the wall. There she was, red-faced, screaming at a child, while Shaq towered over her in the background. Karen's stomach twisted. I can explain," she stammered. Caldwell exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Explain what, exactly? That you thought banning a kid from a pool based on the color of his skin was a good idea?" His expression darkened. "We don't tolerate this kind of behavior. You're fired." Her mouth fell open. "What? No, you can't." "I can, and I just did," he said coldly. With no job and her reputation in ruins, Karen vanished from public view. But her humiliation wasn't over yet. A week later, desperate for a taste of her old luxury, she snuck back to the resort. She wore a wide-brimmed sun hat and oversized sunglasses, hoping to blend in. She hadn't dared show her face in public since the incident, But the thought of being barred from a place she once considered hers gnawed at her. She walked toward the pool's new entrance, heart pounding. The resort had been completely remodeled under Shaq's ownership, and a brand new "Everyone is Welcome" sign stood proudly above the gates. Just as she stepped forward, a large hand landed on her shoulder. She turned sharply and found herself staring into the face of a no-nonsense security guard. "Ma'am," he said, voice firm, "you're banned from this property. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Karen's face flushed. I, I just wanted to see the pool," she muttered. Behind the security guard, she spotted Shaq, lounging in the shade, watching the whole thing unfold. He met her gaze, raised his hand, and waved. His voice was calm but laced with irony. "Still want to swim?" Karen turned on her heel and stormed off as laughter erupted from the nearby guests. Karen's desperation was palpable. Standing outside the resort gates, she clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles white with frustration. The sun bore down on her, beads of sweat forming on her forehead. But the discomfort was nothing compared to the humiliation burning inside her. Just weeks ago, she had strutted through these very gates like she owned the place, dictating who did and didn't belong. Now she was the one on the outside, begging for a second chance. "I've learned my lesson," she pleaded, her voice thin and shaky. "I understand now. Can't we just move on?" The security guard blocking the entrance didn't budge. He merely crossed his arms over his broad chest, expression unreadable. Behind him, the pool sparkled under the summer sun, laughter and joyful splashes echoing in the air. Families of all races and backgrounds lounged in chairs. Kids played together with inflatable floats, and lifeguards kept a watchful eye. But no one paid attention to Karen. She was invisible now, just like she had tried to make little Jaden feel. Then a deep chuckle broke through the noise. Karen turned sharply to see Shaq approaching from the patio, dressed in a casual resort polo, looking every bit like the man in charge. He sipped from a coconut drink, a relaxed smirk on his face as he strolled toward her. His presence alone made Karen shrink back slightly, but she steadied herself, hoping she could appeal to him. "Mr. O'Neill," she started, forcing a smile, "I see now that I was wrong. I should have never treated that boy that way. I regret it, truly." Shaq took a slow sip of his drink before responding. "Regret," he mused, "or just consequences catching up to you?" Karen swallowed hard. "Please, just let me back in." Shaq exhaled, shaking his head as he gestured toward the "Everyone is Welcome" sign hanging above the entrance. "You see this? This is the new rule. No more exclusions, no more power trips, everybody belongs." Karen's lips trembled. "Then why not let me in?" Shaq let the silence stretch between them before he shrugged. "Because Karen—" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for her to hear. "Rules are rules." Karen's face crumpled. Her shoulders sagged as she realized there was no winning this, no arguing, no manipulating her way out. With one last defeated glance at the vibrant, joyful scene she had once tried to control, she turned on her heel and stomped off, her designer sandals clicking angrily against the pavement. Shaq chuckled, watching her go. Taking another sip of his drink, he glanced back at the pool, where Jaden was splashing around with a group of friends, free from judgment, free to just be a kid. With a satisfied grin, Shaq muttered to himself, "See? Inclusion isn't so hard." The camera lingers on the "Everyone is Welcome" sign, sealing Karen's fate as just another lesson learned.